Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Hello. This is it. This is the moment you've been waiting for. Stephen Hopgood, he only has a few minutes with you, so unless you listen now, he's going to go. Thank you. Right. My name is Randolph Kent. I am delighted to be here and particularly delighted to chair Stephen's session. Stephen Hopgood is Reader in International Relations at SOAS. I think Stephen is extremely well known, so I won't go on with the 7 pages of notes that I've accumulated to introduce him. That said, I would like to mention 2 things. One is that Stephen's talk today, I think, is really extremely important, and it's a consistent theme, I think, that has gone in and out of the conference so far. And the theme is, or the issue is, myths and money in the humanitarian marketplace. And I think you'll recognize some of the themes, and I think you'll be, if you like, regard some of the themes that you may not recognize to be deeply important, and perhaps in that context also, Stephen, if I may, just on the human rights dimension as well. And for those of you who really are intrigued by this, and I'm already queuing up, this full text of this and more can be found in his book, The End Times of Human Rights, which will come out towards the middle end of 2013. This, however, was not a, if you like, a message, anything other than, if you're going to like this as much as I know I'm going to, you might want to follow this up with a book. That said, Stephen, let me introduce you now, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Randolph. I'm a little bit daunted. I'd prepared a short presentation yesterday. I was going to be on the same panel as Ronnie, and then Bertrand told me that I was doing a whole session. And then I've listened through several of the sessions, as we all have, and there's been so much material and so many interesting arguments that I've constantly been updating what I was going to try to say in order to say something that hasn't been said before. So I apologize if it occasionally seems a little bit disjointed. I promise you the original 10 minutes was deeply integrated and coherent, and now it's going to come across a little bit like some observations as well as hopefully some theme that runs through. Humanitarianism. Humanitarianism, I'm going to suggest, it's an artifact of, well, I'm not going to say the West, because I don't think the United States and Europe are necessarily tied together in this, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. Humanitarianism is something that the North, the West, does to the rest of the world. And so if the rest of the world is really going to get involved in this, then we're not going to be able to call it humanitarianism anymore. Humanitarianism is the label for a social practice which is about the intervention of the developed world in the developing world. And what we're really witnessing is something in many ways that's positive, which is we're witnessing decolonization. The beginnings of the emergence of serious resistance to a set of universal secular norms that have been exported via empire and then via the League of Nations regime and then via the United Nations and Western states for 150, 160 years. The period we're living through is the period of decolonization. And humanitarianism changing is part of that decolonization process. That's what I'm going to argue anyway. If you look at the critiques of humanitarianism historically, the critique from the left, the critique from the right, and in some sense the critique from below, all of them contain seeds of the critiques that we've worked through in various of the sessions this week, the last couple of days. The critique from the left, humanitarianism is just bourgeois ideology. It depoliticizes communities, it prevents collective organization and action, it becomes about a certain kind of intervention to save life and to support various kinds of activities, but it's not about social change. It doesn't fundamentally change the structures of society. It's reformist. The founders of the ICRC were reformists. 3 of them, of the 5, didn't even have to work, they were so wealthy. Okay, they were all Genevan Calvinist bourgeois philanthropists who were very interested in civilizing their own working class communities and more widely civilizing the margins of Europe at the time. So the critique from the left, the critique from Marx and Engels at the time and from many leftists since is, if you go down this route, nothing fundamentally is going to change. It's not about global structures of inequality. It's about just coping with the phenomena on the surface of inequality and suffering. The critique from the right, from people like Carl Schmitt, from Leo Strauss, from de Maistre and others, in our contemporary era, the critique from people like Alistair McIntyre, is that humanitarianism just erodes community. It actually strikes at the basis of the kind of commitments and obligations that, by tying people together on the basis of identity and shared experience, makes those communities strong and able to withstand various sorts of natural disasters or other forms of social problem that they encounter. So humanitarianism, cosmopolitanism, these things they winnow away the basis of survival for communities, particularly communities in conditions of scarcity or communities which are vulnerable. Neither of those critiques would see what's happening to humanitarianism as necessarily problematic. And then you get the sort of critique from below, which is, as versions of both those other critiques in it, which is really, this is just imperial imposition. All we're really describing is the secular arm of what was once Christianity. It's secularized after the League of Nations in the interwar period. The missionaries begin to decline, and a vast array of secular governance experts begins to emerge, who manage everything from child trafficking, women trafficking, the opium trade, refugees. There's a long, long list of League of Nations sections that are involved in governing the non-Western world. So they take over the empire, effectively, and they start to administer the colonies. So the critique from below is, this is just more of the same. It's just done in a different kind of language. It's done in a development language. It's done in a human rights language. The first myth that I want to challenge today is the myth, therefore, that humanitarianism exists in some sense separately from the social relations in which it's embedded. This seems to me to be a foundational humanitarian myth. That it doesn't matter what's going on politically or socially, what humanitarianism is something that exists in some abstract, pure, moral, compassionate space. And we don't really need to look at the degree to which it's about class relations, it's about the wealthy salving their own consciences in relation to the poor. The advantage of what we've been talking about here this week is to historicize humanitarianism, to re-embed it in its social relations, has got to be a progressive step. It's got to be the first step in really beginning to understand the implications of this social practice and where it can do good and where it's counterproductive. So far from being pessimistic, which is something that various people felt after Mark Duffield's presentation yesterday, I think it's got to be a positive step that we historicize humanitarianism, that we take away the sacred aura of humanitarian work and we start to look at who does it, where they come from. I've always been shocked by how secretive, I think really disgracefully secretive, the International Committee of the Red Cross is about its history and its own archives. I mean, it's the least accountable organization you could possibly imagine. And yet it's an organization which protects its sacredness in this way by saying that what we do is too important for us to be accountable to the people with whom we work. So I think challenging that sort of myth that there's something about humanitarianism which puts it onto that sacred plane has got to be a positive thing. Okay. One of the reasons this myth perpetuates itself, and I've felt this various times listening to people talk over the last couple of days, is because I think humanitarians often make a transfer of morality, motivation, commitment between the individual and the organization, which in fact serves to disguise what's going on. So this room is full of people, practitioners, scholars and others, who are deeply committed, deeply ethical people who have been motivated in their careers and in their work by a desire to help other people, to care for other people. But that's not what humanitarian organizations are about. That's not what the global humanitarian industry is about. So it's a kind of alibi we have because we know so many people who are deeply committed and involved at an operational level, that the regime that we see globally somehow has at its core those values. Okay? Save the Children is $1 billion a year business that's now globally branded. Okay? It sells images of suffering children. I ran through the websites yesterday of the top 10 international NGOs. Think how many analyses there have been in the last 10, 20, 30 years about the use of images of children. 8 of the 10 have images of black children in situations of poverty or suffering on them. This is the business model. This is how you raise funds. Okay? MSF didn't have those images on, I should say. There's a sort of MSF crowd here to some degree. But it's a business model. Now, it doesn't mean that they're not doing some good things with this money, but the weight of the organisation is in a global policy structure run by someone, Jasmine Whitbread, who prides herself on the MBA that she has and on her business experience. It's run as a business. That's the reality about these global international governmental organisations. And it's one strategy for survival for global humanitarian NGOs because there's money in suffering. Okay? Because the poor, the suffering can be subject to strategies of accumulation. Not profits in the narrow sense. Think about it more like Bourdieu's cultural capital. Okay? It's about growth. It's about more fundraising. It's about bigger budgets. It's about being involved in more places. It's about being involved in more intensely in different issues and more marginal issues you can bring in because you're now raising more funds. Okay? But it's part of this general middle-class political economy of philanthropy and humanitarianism. Okay? So that it is a successful model, but we shouldn't give Save the Children an alibi because we know that the initial people who were involved with Save the Children or with Oxfam or with Plan International were often amateurs out there in the field, sacrificing their own health and their own prospects in order to help people. That's really not what the global humanitarian industry looks like now. We did have to embed, I think, that fact. There are other myths that sustain this. And the point I want to make about these other myths, and I'll just run through a few that you can violently disagree with in question and answers, is the point I want to make about this is the business model, the bit that raises the money to pay for various humanitarian schemes, relies on these myths. And there's a disjuncture. Think how critical and analytical we've been over the past 2 days. We all get it. We all get that it doesn't work. We all get that there are it doesn't always work. We get that there are power relations involved and there's inequality involved and there are problems. But the business model that the humanitarian business sells is based upon a series of myths, beautifully illustrated by the Coney 2012 video. Okay? That got 100 million hits in the course of a week because it was done based upon a whole series of tropes about helping Africans that we'll be very familiar with from the civilizational and from post-colonial critiques. So these myths are sold, but we don't embrace them internally because we know that they're myths. We know they're myths in this room, but the business model is about selling these myths. These myths are that it's a story of good versus evil and that we're the good guys. It's a story about purity of motivation. Okay? Many of the organizations that you're familiar with will have an ongoing internal dialogue about the relationship between the operational staff and the marketing, accounting, logistics, and management people. The managers will win this because it's a global operation. Okay? The operational staff can't win it. The operational staff can just detach and go and do their work in some other way. That there's a right answer, even if we haven't found it yet, to many of the problems that we deal with. You don't raise money on the basis that this probably won't work, but we need to keep trying. That all good things go together, to quote the famous analysis of American public life from Louis Hart. That this is not a business or an industry. Peter's presentation yesterday, we may not like it, but we kind of get what Peter's describing. But the idea that this isn't a business or an industry is an extremely powerful part of the business model for raising income. You can't go to donors and say you're just funding a business. Okay? It's got to be about something else. That humanitarianism is the antithesis of power. That humanitarians aren't powerful. And that there is a universal value or human quality called compassion. Okay? Now, we can argue about that. All human societies have feelings of love, obligation, attachment, commitment. We put a particular frame on that and we call it universal compassion, or we call it the sort of instinct behind humanitarianism. The degree to which this way of thinking about relations of obligation and attachment is something that we can challenge as a shared universal value and perhaps need to. So zakat, for example, the relationship that Muslims feel to other Muslims in terms of charity giving. Okay? This is an entirely legitimate way to fund and help other people, but maybe it's about helping other Muslims first. And somehow we would invalidate that by saying that the compassionate roots of universal values require you to be impartial about helping other people. But why do we assume that if you just help people who share an identity with you or they're people like you, then somehow this is an illegitimate part of the philanthropic exercise? The most successful funding mechanisms there are diasporas. The circuit of money through diasporas. People helping people they're related to or are like them in other countries. Hundreds of billions of dollars a year that's sent through these diaspora networks. Okay, how am I doing for time?
You're doing very, very well, but I think you're going to be generating a lot of questions.
Okay, all right. No. Everybody looks bored. Okay, I've said humanitarianism wasn't ever revolutionary. Okay, what's changing? Why is the humanitarian model no longer sustainable? I think a series of things are changing. What I'm doing here is fleshing out this idea that we're living through an era of decolonization. I think we're living through an era where there is a fundamental challenge to the norms on which the international system is based. That's what I mean by decolonization. We assume that norms should be universal. We assume that they should be secular. We can argue about this in Q&A. But if we don't mind them being religiously anchored for some, but the legitimation of those norms can't be that they're Christian norms or that they're Muslim norms. They're secular norms, and we know that the aid and development industry is based around those secular norms. And also I'd argue they're categorical in that you can't trade away aspects of these norms. You can't say in some circumstances maybe they won't get the full norm. They'll get part of the norm, because that takes us back into a more explicit civilizational rhetoric. But I think this idea that norms must be universal, secular, and categorical is just a hangover from European empire. It's the Europeans, and the age we're living through is the decline of European ideological hegemony. It's just taken a long time. It's taken 50, 60 years after the end of the Second World War for this to begin to play itself out. The norms on which the League of Nations and the United Nations were based were constitutively universal and secular. And the agencies set up were legitimized by this idea that they worked on behalf of everybody in a neutral and impartial way. But is it so, then this is really, I suppose, one of my core questions, is it really so obvious that norms that aren't legitimated or operationalized in that way are illegitimate? Norms where you help other people like you? If you don't directly do harm to others, why is it a problem that you help people like you? That's how most societies function, helping people you're related to or people who are like you. That's why the diasporas are so successful. You don't need to make humanitarian appeals within the diaspora. There are various partial commitments to people based upon identity that generate funding within these diasporic networks. So humanitarianism was always related to a way of seeing the world which was universal and global. Solutions at some level had to be universal and global. In other words, the language of global governance is just a kind of recasting, a rebooting of a certain kind of imperial way of seeing the world. We consider ourselves to be the good guys because we're not legitimated by civilizational rhetoric. But it's not obvious that some of the things that Human Rights Watch says in its reports are so different from things the missionaries would have said 100 years ago. The way in which various societies are demonized, the way in which various state leaders are described as effectively evil, it's not so different from what you would have seen 100 years ago. So, okay. So Europe doesn't have the ideological or the political power anymore to sustain these norms. What are the implications of this? One answer might be the Americans will step in. And my answer to that would be, I don't think the Americans will step in. I think the Americans have looked at this regime in an ambivalent way for as long as you can remember. The Americans aren't interested in multilateral institutions except in trade and security. Their opposition to the International Criminal Court is almost exactly the same as the Chinese opposition to the International Criminal Court, which is a combination of we have our own national destiny and we're powerful enough to say no. Their opposition to fundamental core human rights treaties like the Children's Rights Convention, the grudging agreement to the Genocide Convention. The United States, I think, in this way we need to disaggregate the West. It will not step in and provide what's required to support that, those universal secular norms. Deeply skeptical about the United Nations. Once the United States begins to become more of a first amongst equals power internationally, and there's budgetary constraints, then it's not obvious that the United Nations will be funded to the same degree it's been funded because it's entirely dependent on that huge chunk of American funding. Unless the Chinese and the Indians and others are going to step in and replace that funding, then what the UN does is going to have to contract. And that will suit China fine, because China, Russia, India want a much more, I'll argue, and many of you will be more knowledgeable than me and will tell me I'm wrong, but my sense is they want a much more traditional, sovereignty-based, reciprocal regime. Human rights is already something being pushed towards the Human Rights Council in Geneva. It's something that will happen in Europe. It's not something that's going to bother the Security Council. The Security Council should be about interstate security matters. And with the human rights goes, and the whole analysis I'm making is a bigger problem for human rights than humanitarianism, and I'll explain why I think that at the very end. So the United States won't step in. You also now have, and this is, some of you will doubtless come back to me on this, but I think you can make the case that you now have, for two or three reasons, resistance in principle to the idea of these universal secular norms. You have, for the first time, a great power like China able to stand up to the United States, able to provide protection for countries like Sri Lanka or Cambodia, implicit protection in international institutions, that says no to these regimes. We don't have to abide, but we'll do our own version of humanitarianism, which follows energy needs or sphere of influence needs, but we don't need to buy into this global humanitarian regime. We're not going to mimic what you're doing. We can do something else. You also have the growth of both religious intensity and the growth of larger middle classes in many developing countries. You all know better than I how powerful that anti-colonial discourse is in places like India, Brazil, South Africa. It doesn't take very much to stir that up. Why will there not be indigenous organizations and an indigenous discourse about assistance in terms of disaster, in terms of development, in terms of social needs, that will come from the bottom, not the top, and the idea is not from supplicant communities, subordinate communities, subaltern communities, but communities that consider themselves, states that consider themselves to be the equal of any European state on the international system. Why will they not? What someone said in the earlier presentation, what's in it for them buying into the global humanitarian regime? Why will they not just do their own thing? Think about this in terms of the funding that we see. Huge Gulf funding, for example, in Libya, the Islamic foundations. This is surely going to be another feature of our world, and that there's no reason again for funding that's wealth that's generated in this way to necessarily be spent according to priorities that are established in Geneva or New York. Okay, I'm nearly done. Okay. All right. Okay, 2 or 3 comments to finish up about what will be left if my apocalyptic vision of the humanitarian regime comes to pass. What will we do if suddenly we're excluded from some areas? I think actually humanitarianism in its very core, narrow sense does pretty well in this world. I think the first thing it has to do is detach itself from human rights. My bigger argument is that the human rights regime suffers far more from the changes I'm outlining than the humanitarian regime. There will always be help. There will always be a need for help in terms of immediate crisis logistics, relief work, the classic relief work. Because the classic relief work isn't loaded in the same way. The Good Samaritan didn't ask about codes of conduct, didn't ask about whether or not this aid was going to be effective. There was just an attempt to provide immediate crisis aid. I can imagine all states calling for international expertise to help with the immediate aftermath of crisis. But what's not going to continue is the development phase, the human rights phase. Stop talking the language of human rights. We're not doing the development stuff anymore, okay? You can come and help us find bodies in buildings and establish shelters, but that can't morph into development. So the humanitarians do reasonably well out of that, but there's no political content in that. So what about the urge to be involved in some kind of more transnational social movement that does push for social change and development change? I think the first question you have to ask is whether we're in the 99%. Maybe that movement for social change is going to have to come through a more solidarity-based set of commitments. Something more like the churches, something more like Quakers internationally, something more like the Anglican Church internationally, where what ties you into helping others, not in that crisis situation, but in terms of development after that, is that you share a faith, a commitment, or an identity to others. And that makes the circuit of capital through this network less problematic because you're sharing with people on the basis that they share some form of identity with you. That takes us back into the political. It takes us back into the relationship that we have across borders with other people. And that, and this will be my last comment, and that opens up a question which has been implicit in much of what we've talked about, and that's why I mentioned the 99% but not explicit. We still have that very north-south frame, but a lot of the things that we're talking about, a lot of the things that Mark, for example, was talking about yesterday, are true of within our own societies. Marginalised communities, gated housing developments. Britain is effectively, to use this as an example, becoming almost all about investment in the southeast of England. New tube lines, expanding the airports. It's, of course, a global financial capital. That's why there's so much. But the rest of the countries, to some degree, fending for itself because the resources that it was required to provide in the past are no longer necessary. So there may be a basis for more transnational organisation across borders and more political or more faith-based international mobilisation. And that takes us back to the beginning, which is the role of humanitarianism and more latterly human rights in deflecting leftist politics, in deflecting political organisation, in deflecting a more collective form of interest or identity-based resistance to structures of power. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I must admit I found that extraordinarily interesting, extraordinarily provocative. Thank you very much indeed. Now, I think we have about 4 hours till the end of this session, so we should be able to at least touch some of the issues that Steve raised. But unfortunately, the reality is we have about 25 minutes or so. So would someone like to start with a question? We have a question from Médecins Sans Frontières there. Thanks. We start with you.
MSF has always been outspoken. So I'm Fabrice from MSF, and thank you, Stephen, for your presentation. I would like to make a comment. I would disagree with your statement according to which the universality of humanitarian norm is being contested these days and appear only as a contingent with European history. I think what we observe is quite the opposite, is empirically speaking, humanitarian norms or human rights norms have become universal in the sense that they are claimed by everyone, even the Shabab militia in Somalia during the food crisis in 2001 organized what they described as humanitarian relief operation for the population under their control, and did publicize this operation as humanitarian ones. Even Al-Qaeda theologians recognize the legitimacy of what they call genuine humanitarian action. Even the government of Sri Lanka, when it bombed the last territory held by the tiger where hundreds of thousands of people were gathered, called this operation a humanitarian operation. So what we see is the opposite. The humanitarian norms have become universal. Everybody claims to be a humanitarian. It has become the international dress code, the lingua franca of the international arena. But Europeans, the UN, have lost the monopoly on saying what it means to be a humanitarian. And the meaning of humanitarian, and this I would agree with you, that somehow there is a decolonization process in a sense that the meaning of what it means to be humanitarian is now being challenged by Global South. Not only the NATO bombs can be called humanitarian, Sri Lankan bombs can also be called humanitarian.
Is this on? Yeah. I agree with you completely. Of course, the language has become so ubiquitous. And that's part of its weakness, that it doesn't have, its soft boundaries mean that it can be reoriented and re-employed. I mean, we know in the past eugenics was legitimated under the label of humanitarianism. So it effectively becomes meaningless. It may well be a functional category in some circumstances, for example, to gain access, to attract funding, to attract international support by waving a flag which says this is a human rights movement or issue or humanitarian movement or issue. But in terms of what's actually, when you look in detail at the substantive commitments that the people using that language have, then they're going to bear minimal relationship to those very abstract, universal, secular legitimations for global norms. So I think it's a positive step that people re-own that sort of language and redefine it. But it's not legitimated in terms of its universal and secular nature. It's recustomized in numerous local circumstances. But then it doesn't...
Where's the difference? What's the difference?
Because...
It's been customized by the North, it's been customized by the South. Everyone customizes these very vague notions.
But then it precisely loses its traction at the global level, its function at the global level. It doesn't function in the way it used to function, which is to legitimate a structure of interventionist power. So the language begins to lose its meaning at the international level. It doesn't function as a structure of power anymore because it's lost its specificity. It can't be monopoly defined from the center now. Everyone can own it. And so the language moves on to something else. That would be my answer to that.
Thank you very much, Steve. I think we have Peter Walker over there, Antonio Donini, and then we'll come to you. Peter, can you give us your question?
Very quickly. Very quickly. Broadly accepting your argument, Stephen, so two questions that come out of it to me. One is essentially, if we believe this is true, how do you present those arguments to, within the business, the good people who do good things? You know, it's an extraordinarily depressing story to hear if you've devoted your life to alleviating suffering without the cynicism and without all of the negativism that goes along with it. So one, how do you speak this message to those who you hope will be allies in the future? And secondly, the message essentially is one of core humanitarianism maybe being able to survive, and the other one of solidarity is actually, if you look at most solidarity movements, they're essentially subversive. And that puts you in a very different position to be a subversive worker rather than part of the system. So where does that take the notion of international agencies? Outside legal structures?
I think given the time, I'm going to ask Antonio maybe if he could ask his question, see if we can cluster some of them.
Clusters, I love them. Listening to Stephen, which I found fascinating, brought me back, I'm old enough to remember these debates about dependency theory back in the 1960s, 70s, where there was this view that the citadels of the North were organizing North-South economic flows in a way that sort of broadly echoes what you said and what Mark said yesterday. But the difference is that then we had a unifying theory that allowed us to combat against these issues, which was Marxism or, that kind of tradition. Now that tradition, much to the dislike of some of us, no longer exists. So I don't see how we could build, I don't see a clear sense that a new theory is emerging that allows for solidarity revolution on the terms that you've presented. I see more a different type of Cold War around identity issues and maybe religion, fundamentalism, and maybe China in a different kind of position. But I'm not sure. I agree that the norms that we've developed are in crisis and that we should perhaps go back to basic and focus. Even Al-Shabaab may need an ambulance at one point. But I'm not sure that we can create a unifying movement around the kind of ideas that raise all sorts of questions that you raised.
Okay, there's quite a lot there. In response to you, Peter, I mean, one question would be if somebody came to you now at 18 and they said, well, what organization should I join? What should I do in order to make the most positive contribution I could on an international basis? Would the answer be to join an international humanitarian NGO? It might be to join a different kind of organization. One of the things I don't want to do, and I don't think, and I certainly don't believe in, is to undermine the direct contact between people in immediate situations, the classic face-to-face assisting other people that in various ways we engage in every day when we help people that we come across in our everyday lives, let alone at a great distance. A huge amount of direct solace, compassion, the saving of people has taken place in those one-to-one relationships. It's not that I think that that's all, I mean, that's saved millions of lives that otherwise wouldn't have been saved. It's just that things have changed, things are changing, and that model now gives you sort of stark choices, and maybe that's in relation to Antonio's question, what you do. It's not clear the left in some form wouldn't. The left is still still a very attractive way to think about mobilization outside Western countries. So maybe there would be a return of the left. That I think what you're likely to see is that's partly why you see a resurgence of religious belief, because it gives you a transnational form of association with other people elsewhere that overcomes the sort of the nationalist silos that we're stuck into. And so you may get something more like nonconformist religion. That you would get the equivalent of the secular Quakers. People would join solidarity movements on that basis. And that would be about more than just occasionally going and helping other people. Maybe it would be a tithing process. I mean, at some level, zakat is quite a progressive idea, that within the community, you owe 10% or whatever of your earnings to redistribute through the community. And so maybe there would be something of that sort. That would be my answer. But I can't remember your second question. Can you remember Peter's second point on that?
Peter.
And I think that's the question about whether one is in the 99% or not. That it's at some level, somebody was telling me, it might even have been you, Antonio, about the average age of an MSF employee has gone up by 10 years. That means pensions, that means, long-term institutionalization. It must restrict agility or flexibility.
Thank you. Let's you just introduce yourself?
Thanks. Sorry. My name is Henrik Freymark, and I work with an NGO. It's even a Christian, church-related NGO. And I think my comment and question is about us being part of a business and also the academia being part of the same business, which I think is true. We are a part of a business, but I find this business very bipolar or even schizophrenic, because at the same time as it's true that we have communications departments working on how to sell black children to the general public, we also, I think there's one or two in this room who are actually paid by the government's fund to criticize this very idea of us selling the idea of children to the general public. Because our business model is also, and I think it's important to say, that I think that the organizations are actually wanting to do good and trying to sell the idea to back donors, governments, that we have the capacity to do good and we have the will to do good. So please also, except funding all our projects, please fund people who criticize the system and make it better, which I think is part of this, well, schizophrenic idea. And my question is, do you think that's any validity in that idea, or, and if it is, where does it take the industry in the future?
Yeah, I think that's a good. What I'm reading is a sense that I'm both cynical about the motivations of the people involved in humanitarianism and cynical about the enterprise as a whole, and I'm not cynical about that. I just don't think that the vocation that's abstracted from power relations exists. I think we're implicated and embedded in these power relations. And so at the same time as, you know, the Victorian moralists sacrificed a huge amount of their own income, their own health often. The missionaries often lived and died in the communities they worked with. It wasn't that they didn't make commitments and sacrifices. But when we step back from that and look at it at a more structural level, we can see that there are unequal power relations at work there. So I think it's a very positive thing within societies that are powerful that they do try to puzzle through what their obligations are to other people. But that's only going to be part of the story. So the fact that we have an inner critique about is a society can only survive long term by having that internal dialogue about what obligations it has to others. But that there's a lot of other story, and part of that story is a structural inequality between societies which are in positions of power and societies which are not. So I don't think that was a very good answer to your question. Right?
Can you hear me?
If you stand up, I think you'll be fine.
Stephen, I must say, let me first introduce myself. My name is Vijay Kumar. My name is Vijay Kumar. I work with ActionAid as one of the international head who just signed a strategy for raising our funds using the model that you are talking of, at least to half of Save the Children's current revenue. So I adopt a humanitarian approach by using rights-based approach. So all the things that you talked of, though it is aimed, I can be alleged to be actually using all the things that you said is going wrong, I totally agree with your analysis. I completely agree with your analysis. I would just like to add one dimension to what you were saying. There is in my understanding, there is definitely a shift of the power. But I would refuse to accept the humanitarianism and human rights-based approach as a scavenger of a capitalistic system. But I would actually say that enabled the communities that we work with the people in the poorer countries that enable them to challenge the current structure. Let us recognize that. To challenge the paradigm. So what it means that let's not only talk of that India, China, or Brazil are coming as the new leaders. Let's look at what the new leaders are. Who are the new leaders? It is not China government, Indian government, or Brazil government which is emerging as new leader. But if you go there inside, it is the poor people and their federation and their solidarity that is actually coming out. It is in the form of Arab Spring today, or perhaps tomorrow is another spring in China or India or Brazil. So it is the solidarity of the South-South that exists across the globe. It is a solidarity between you and me. I don't come from a south, a northern part of north. I do come from south of north, or I come from a south of south. So that is the solidarity which is being built, and that we need to recognize that these processes of adopting a human rights-based, still accepting the universality of human rights, which recognize at least the four fundamental things, that your right to life, your right against the torture, your right against the slavery, these are the fundamental, is universal. If we are accepting those and actually still saying that this solidarity across the globe is the new rule of the game. So nationality is blurring. The division south and north, that is actually widening. And we are also seeing a blurring division between so-called humanitarianism, so-called development, so-called recovery. So that part is actually blurring. So it is no more, we cannot actually see the distinction as to where the humanitarianism stops and where the development starts. So that is what is my understanding. I will actually request you to give your critical feedback of what I am saying.
Thank you. I interpret that partly as a version of Ronnie's question as well. Of course, I'm putting this case in a really strong way, and there are many, many caveats one might make about this. And your question and Ronnie's question point at one of them, which is to say that if one focuses on state-level challenges to these universal norms, then the picture I'm presenting is persuasive, I would argue. But once one goes below that level, the more emancipatory capacity of human rights organizations that are transnationally organized or humanitarian organizations in helping people who may well be, their own states may be predatory on them in one way or another, may generate a more sort of international solidarity movement from south to the south of north, or, which may well be more effective and may give a renewed life to that sort of humanitarian or human rights industry. I do have a caveat to that, which is more, I would say, targeted at the leaders of the major international humanitarian NGOs and the leaders of the major international human rights NGOs. And that would be, that for me, they're deeply implicated in these top-down power and authority structures. They're part of the 0.1%. You know, they raise funds, they're engaged with, you know, the State Department, they talk to, they're in the Obama White House. They're not separate from these structures. And they buy into a particular sort of imperial or hegemonic view of their role, which I think you see most clearly in relation to the International Criminal Court and the ICRC. They're deeply imperialist, secretive, and arrogant, in my view, organizational attitude towards pretty much everybody else. So you might well get it, but you still need a much more radical version of humanitarianism and human rights that takes you out of the major global organizations into local organizations. But you know, we should be, I didn't mean to be negative. I mean, you know, we all know, maybe we're being negative about ourselves, but let's assume we're all involved in this because we care about improving people's social conditions. Well, something's happening. There's movement. If you tell the story of the last 100 years, there's a good degree of stasis there. But now there's energy, and it's not coming from the West. It's not coming from London, Geneva, New York, Paris. It's coming from Cairo and Jakarta and Kuala Lumpur, and it's Thailand and Beijing. It's coming from somewhere else. And that may well be a very positive side, although for us, the West, well, it's going to be very destabilizing, of course.
Steve, thank you very much. We have Mark there, and we have a young lady here, and a hand there, and another hand there, and another hand there. And I've been told that we have now 7 minutes. So can you all be very concise? And I know, Steve, you're going to just move on to get
Yes, no, yes, yes, no.
Yeah, okay. I just wanted to follow on, if you like, from what you just left off. I think this idea of decolonisation is very important, and what I'd like to suggest is maybe we can see it as the second independence struggle. The first independence struggle took place, obviously, in the 40s and 50s around decolonisation itself and was based in the state. Now we're seeing the second independence struggle based in civil society. And in both of those occasions, it involved the international or the West letting go. And that process of letting go, in the first instance, had to confront imperialism. But letting go now is going to have to confront the business model.
I agree, yeah. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, letting go of the business model. And that I mean, it will be tough because, of course, those businesses are powerful, and it's part of the major global organizations have the same kind of defensive attitude often to doubters and to critics as states once had.
Yeah, I'm Yasmin again from India. Very quickly, on a kind of philosophical level, what is happening to the human of humanitarianism in this kind of collapse that you're talking about? I'm wondering that the moral legitimation of the earlier top-down approach was on a sense of good life, etc., which is critiqued. I don't want to get into that. But so are we going to have now multiple ideas of what the good life is and also define what suffering is? Because that is kind of troublesome. We don't know what those definitions are. So how do we then relate this universal idea of good life and suffering to multiple versions of it, and therefore multiple aid and relief for that?
Okay, of course that's a huge question. There have been periods of human history when there have been dominant civilizations, and there have been periods when there's been pluralism and fragmentation, and we're heading into a pluralism and fragmentation phase. I mean, India's been one of the societies which has really pushed this idea of multiple secularisms, multiple modernities, that there isn't one path to modernity. And part of that is there isn't an overreaching liberal subjectivity, which is the end point of any sort of development process. So maybe a fully developed human being is one who lives within a close, intimate family structure and doesn't think and act in terms of someone who's autonomous from the wishes of their parents or their siblings or their community. Maybe that will be a conception of a good life, which can now get some traction because there isn't a structure of ideological and political domination and a marketplace which tries to eradicate or pressure that, pressure you into abandoning that. So I've had very interesting conversations with people like Rajiv Bhargava saying, look, why do we have to have that Western version of secularism? Like we need an Indian version of this, which is not about getting rid of the gods. It's about finding a different way to do it, a different kind of modernity, but not that European model of modernity. But at the root of that European model of modernity is the liberal subject. That's Locke, Hobbes, Kant, and that looked like it was a discovery, and then it became part of a culture, and that's what's, to some degree, being challenged, I think.
Giuliano Fiori from Save the Children. Thanks for a very robust and pretty damning critique, not just of Save the Children, but of the whole enterprise. My question, well, it's not actually, I suppose, a question, half a comment, but much like Antonio, in fact, some tenets of dependency theory were kind of raised by your talk. And if we look at Latin America, the kind of home of dependency theory, of liberation theology, now, despite so-called centre-left governments in power, there's been a sweep of neoliberalism across the whole region that's just taken hold. And in fact, one of the main proponents of dependency theory, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, was the main implementer of neoliberal reforms. You asked what of indigenous initiatives growing from the global south, organizations, theories, philosophies, etc. My question to you is, what is to suppose the same economic and political power relations won't result in political power co-opting those initiatives like it does here in the West and the global North?
Yeah, I mean, that is a question. I mean, I don't come at this from a Marxist position per se, but part of what one has to do in deconstructing these myths is to embed these ideological ideas in their material structure, their context. And so the reality is that in many of these societies, it's middle classes who pursue human rights and humanitarianism, that it's part of a cultural conception of civilization, and they're very associated with the governing elites. And so a lot of the human capital, as we know, leaves developing countries and moves to the West, and there's a high human capital mobility in that level. So the poor have a problem. The disenfranchised have a problem, and that's not humanitarianism's fault, it's not human rights' fault. They had a problem before, they have a problem now, which is that they don't have, unless they can collectively organize, sufficient social power in order to challenge the structures that govern and organize their lives. So I would, if I were being more pessimistic, I would say it'll just be, of course it'll just be, those indigenous movements will just be co-opted. And if they threaten the state, then they'll just be violently co-opted, which you see in Britain, let alone elsewhere. Any attempt to, protest about tuition fees, you get more police than protesters on the streets of London, about what's really a pretty minor resistance to the state. So.
I'm going to, at the expense of antagonizing the organizers, just go on for another 5 minutes, if that's okay with you. There are lots of hands still. One hand there, and I'm never sure how Jonathan Dimbleby does this when he looks out at that massive audience and remembers who's out there. But I know we have a question here. Was there another question over there? No? Is there going to be a question there? No, there's not. So any question other than that? Fine. Sir.
Okay, so I got 5 minutes to the question. No, I just wondered whether, my name's Simon Harrigan, by the way, and I've been wishing for 20 years of working in this for exactly the scenario you're presenting, that will do ourselves out of a job. And I keep on finding myself faced by the amazing organic ability of the humanitarian world to adapt to new situations. And I wonder whether you're conflating the vulnerability of the people in this room and sensitivity of our sensitivity with the vulnerability of the international humanitarian system, which, as far as I can see, has very well been able to adapt as a sort of organic organism to move on to a new identity.
I don't mean to conflate them, and I hope I at least made mention in the talk that I think there's a big difference between those people, and one of the reasons that humanitarians, I think, do adapt is because, in fact, within humanitarianism, with some notable exceptions, there's a degree of reflexivity about what the social practice is, why it does or doesn't work. There's a constant attempt to try to do better, which my suggestion would be you don't find in the human rights world in quite the same way. But it is very adaptive. Partly, I think, for material reasons. Lots of people have salaries and pensions, and there's a lot of very, very smart people who are able to raise money, and therefore that will keep the operation on the road. There was a point I wanted to make. Let me just try to to grab it in relation to that, which I thought I hadn't made very clearly, which was in terms of this adaptability, there'll always be something you can do as a humanitarian. There'll always be the capacity to go and help other people. It may well not happen at the same distance logistically that you would do it through an international humanitarian organization. So there is an adaptability at that level, but that is very different from these major international organizations. And maybe small scale will be better. Maybe genuine expertise will be better. People who really know how to dig a well, people who really know how to immunize a population, and less of the more general development-related work. Okay, that was a bit of a flat note to end on, so sorry about that.
Anyway, it certainly wasn't a flat note, and as I said earlier, that Steve is putting this together in a book that'll come out next year, so I very much look forward to seeing it. I think you've really triggered a tremendous amount of interest, thought, very provocative, very worthwhile. Just before we thank Steve, what I'd like to do is just mention that after this, there'll be a 40-minute performance. Unfortunately, they didn't tell me a performance about what. But anyway, a performance in the auditorium. And secondly, I'd also like to mention, and this is probably something that I can grasp far more quickly and far more readily and understandably, there's going to be a drinks reception at the Royal Northern College of Music from 6 p.m. So I don't know what the auditorium has to offer, but I certainly know what the Royal Northern College of Music has to offer. But before you head off into all those directions, let me say, Steve, this has been very worthwhile. Thank you very much indeed.